Hello, I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry. Thank you for joining us today for Ask the Pet Food Pro, Unlock the Potential of Freeze-Dried Pet Food, a practical guide for manufacturers. Ask the Pet Food Pro is a series of professional chats that offers an unparalleled opportunity to connect with industry experts and pose the questions that are most on your mind. Ask the Pet Food Pro is brought to you by Pet Food Forum and Pet Food Industry's journalists and editors. Drawing on our combined decades of experience covering the dog, cat, and other pet food markets, you can find our reporting and analysis at petfoodindustry.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and magazine. Today's discussion centers on the hot topic of freeze-dried pet foods and ingredients. Parker Freeze Dry sponsors this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro, and our expert guest is Matt Gronke, Sales and Marketing Manager at Parker Freeze Dry. Welcome, Matt, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim.
So before we start the discussion, I do have a few announcements. Audience members, you've all been muted to ensure that everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. So please submit your questions or comments in the chat box. Please note that this chat is being recorded, so you can access the recording in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com. Click on the Ask the Pet Food Pro tab at the top. So Matt, let's break the ice by discussing the basics of freeze drying. So could you give me an overview of the freeze drying process? What is the typical production timeline for a batch of freeze dried pet food from ingredient preparation to packaging?
That's a good place to start, Tim. I would say let's talk about the freeze dry process itself first, because that's the part that I know the best. Typically, you're going to be dealing with a batch time, and it can really vary depending on what your product is. And there's a lot of variables in play, such as, how thick is your product? What is the makeup of the product? Is it a formulation? Is it a single ingredient? There's a lot of things to take into consideration. In most cases in the pet food industry, you're typically seeing, around a batch per day. And that's typically including, your turnover time from loading the machine, running the batch, going through the defrost cycle after you've unloaded the machine, and then turning it over and getting it ready to the next one. When it comes to your pre-process, when what you mentioned earlier, that's something with a lot of different variables. It's probably a whole nother webinar in itself. Really depends on what you're making and how you're going about getting it ready for this step in the process. Post-process, what you're typically going to see is just moving it on to the next step, whether you're working as a co-man and you're shipping your finished freeze-dried product in bulk to someone else for them to package, or if you're handling the whole thing, then the next step is going to take you into the packaging phase.
Gotcha. So getting through the actual freeze drying process, what kind of equipment is needed for freeze drying? And if a pet food maker isn't ready to invest in that equipment, what are some options available to them?
Perfect. Yeah. So ultimately, the freeze dry systems are really good at freeze drying, but even though it says freeze in the name, they're terrible freezers. There's no airflow. It's a vacuum chamber. So the number one thing that needs to be a piece of the puzzle is, can you pre-freeze a batch large enough to feed your freeze dry system? And what I like to suggest is that you've got the capacity in your freeze process to basically be one batch ahead all the time. So that's going to be the number one consideration. Beyond that, it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about. There is a lot of different steps and a lot of different processes involved in the prep phase. So depending on if you're going with a formulation, if you're going with a single ingredient, if you're buying your raw materials in whole large pieces, or if you're buying them already cubed, that's going to change how you have to approach that side of the equation.
Gotcha. So now we've talked a little bit about what freeze drying is. Let's talk about what it isn't. How does freeze drying differ from some other preservation methods like dehydration or air drying?
Yeah, so you basically have got a lot of different ways to get things done. Freeze drying we kind of know that this is a very gentle way of removing moisture from a product without doing any harm to any nutrients or any kind of flavors or any of those things. Even the appearance of it can remain the same. What happens mostly with the other ways, and there's no wrong way to do it, it's still getting it dry. It's just what is your goal at the end. So you can work with a heating system, something that's more of a continuous where it's running down a conveyor through a set of ovens. What's happening there is they're involving heat. Well, heat breaks down things. Air dry, you're running air over it, but you're still moving warm air, room temperature air over things. Low heat type scenarios at the end of the day is still heat. So you kind of got to figure out what's your goal. What are you trying to accomplish, and to determine which direction you should be going when you're looking at this stuff.
I see. And when we're talking about some of those ingredients that are going into the process, are there some types that are better suited for freeze drying, and why are those ingredients perhaps a little better suited for freeze drying?
When you're freeze drying, there's a couple things you typically want to stay away from. High fat content is one of them. High sugars, high Brix counts provides a little bit more challenges. On the pet side, you don't see it too much with the sugars and things like that, but fat in particular doesn't freeze dry very well, and provides challenges in shelf stability after the fact. It starts to oxidize. So you typically are going to see a lot more leaner formulations when it comes to the pet industry.
Gotcha. So there's some limitations, challenges maybe with some ingredients that have a high fat content. What about different textures and things like that? Is there other variables that can affect the ingredients?
I would say it affects the end product more. The process itself with freeze drying, what you want is you want surface area and you want lots of it because you need a lot of space for that moisture to escape from. So the larger your product is, if you're using a 1-inch cube or, for example, an entire slab of beef, okay, is going to take an exceptionally a long amount of time. If you've got a 1-pound steak, you put that into 1/4-inch cubes or 1/2-inch cubes, you're going to see much better results. So you just kind of got to keep that in mind. Surface area is the key, followed by consistency. If they're all the same size, you're setting yourself up for much more success.
Gotcha. Consistency is key. So in the preparation for this, we always get some questions from the audience ahead of time, and a number of them have focused on the idea of kill steps and pet food safety. Could you talk a little bit about how freeze-dried pet foods can avoid problems with spoilage or pathogens?
Yeah, this is a fun topic. There's a lot going on with this as we speak, and it always comes up. So I'm glad that we're getting into it. So the kill step, when it comes to freeze drying, you got a couple different things going on. You can rely on a secondary process. It could be something that's being completed prior to you receiving your raw materials by your vendor that you're purchasing from. Some of the secondary processes involved, you've got irradiation, you've got HPP. There's a lot of different ways to go about it. As far as within the process, we do know that there are people that are using the system as programming a kill step into the system, taking it up to the temperature that's needed, and they're finding success doing it that way. The key thing is you just got to kind of find what works best for your system and weigh your risks and what's going to be the best route for you to go.
Gotcha. So when we're speaking of keeping pet food products safe and fresh, let's go into a little bit about how freeze drying a product can affect its shelf life compared to some other methods of preservation.
Well, shelf life is going to be probably the biggest benefit. Because of the lack of moisture in your finished product, the stability is greatly increased. You're going to find varying information when you look around. Some places are saying, 30 years, some are saying 20, some are saying 12. We don't know how long it's going to last yet, just because we haven't been doing this for 30 years yet. But ultimately, if you package it properly and you have good discussions with your experts in the packaging industry, they're the ones that are doing the research on how to do it the best way. What you'll typically is going to see is you're going to want to protect it from sunlight. You're going to want to put some kind of prevent oxidation packet to put in there to help keep it that way. And you want to keep it out of the atmosphere. Um, because freeze-dried food in regular atmosphere will begin to absorb moisture back into it. If you leave it out long enough, it'll lose that crispness and start to become spongy after a while. How long that takes varies a lot depending on the product and the conditions.
Gotcha, gotcha. So along with that, how would freeze drying then influence the pet food buyers, the pet owners, storage of those products compared to pet foods made with other types of ingredients?
As far as the buyers are concerned, I think where the biggest benefit is going to be is for those that are, doing a frozen raw diet currently. There's exceptional amount of challenges in freezer space when it comes to that. Plus, having to go and replace it because you're not buying it as large quantities. As a pet owner, being able to get a freeze dried raw diet instead, you eliminate that freezer space. You can just keep it in your pantry. You can keep it in your closet, wherever you're keeping your other dry goods, and not have to deal with the logistics of finding the freezer space for that.
Gotcha. So similarly, when we're talking about preserving pet foods and keeping them fresh on the shelves, uh, in what way does freeze drying preserve the nutritional value of ingredients compared to cooking or baking?
It's basically going to all revolve around the fact that it's a gentle process um, when done properly. We're using a very, very minimal amount of heat, so you're not seeing that degradation that comes with higher heat methods. So when it comes to the nutritional value, you're not tearing anything apart at a molecular level. The nutrients are remaining. The everything is all staying to the potency that it would as if it was fresh. For the most part, there's a slight amount, but when looking at the comparisons from freeze dry versus air dry versus baking versus all the other different methods that are out there, you'll find that the freeze dried seems to come out on top in almost every case that I've seen so far.
Gotcha. So now nutrition and safety only really matter if a pet will actually eat the products. So how does texture and palatability of freeze-dried pet food enhance its appeal to pets and to their owners too?
Well, if it's any indication, when I mix together with regular food with my dogs, they eat around the other stuff. Um, Basically, you got to make sure you've still got something that's visually appealing to them, and that they like the smell, they like the taste. And so far, from what we're seeing in the market and from what we're hearing, even something as little as just adding a freeze-dried topper to an existing diet increases the amount of interest it's getting from those from amount of interest it's getting from the pet that's digging into the bowl there.
Gotcha. So, when freeze-dried pet foods certainly seem to appeal to pet owners, and I've noticed a marked rise in the number of new pet food products that are featuring freeze-dried meats, veggies, and fruits. What consumer trends are driving this demand for freeze-dried pet food products?
I think over the last 4, 5, 6 years here, people have been paying a lot more attention to what they're feeding their animals, and we can see it in the industry with the amount of interest that there has been suddenly in nutritional information for pet food, where that was never really a discussion 10 years ago. There seems to be an exceptional amount of interest just in the innovation side of things as well, because we're able to get high nutrition um, raw materials, at a typically a little bit less expensive than what you're seeing with other things. So mainly it's just coming down to what they want to give their foods. There was a massive spike in the amount of pets that were acquired in the last 4 or 5 years, and it just seems like the general public in general has really kind of humanize their pets. So they're paying way more attention to what they're getting in their diet than what we used to see.
Gotcha. Humanization has definitely been one of the driving forces in the pet food industry. And so when we're talking about that topic of consumer demands, sustainability is another one of those driving forces, along with humanization and premiumization. So as pet food owners, or excuse me, as pet food buyers and consumers are increasingly looking for products that don't compromise the ability of future generations to enjoy the same standard of living that we enjoy. We talked about the production process earlier. And it sounds energy intensive, but it also seems like it could reduce food waste and pollution related to transport. So, are there any specific environmental benefits to freeze drying that manufacturers could highlight for eco-conscious consumers?
There's a lot of different things going on. And you're correct. Well, the freeze drying process itself is fairly it uses a substantial amount of energy. Where the sustainability aspect comes in, both comes in the pre side of things, as far as the sourcing of the ingredients, allowing you to do more with less, or to take items that would otherwise you would be, considered as a refuse type of an item that still has nutritional value, and turning that into something. So there's benefit there. On the backside, that's when you see most of the benefits. It's downstream of the process. Now you're dealing with less weight. You're dealing with less costs for storage concerns. You're dealing with a lot of different opportunities to basically look down the stream on everything that happens after the fact.
Gotcha. So, from environmental concerns to nutrition to safety, freeze-dried pet foods and treats may answer many of the issues in the pet food industry. Let's look at a few of these questions that have come in from the audience as we've been speaking, and see what other topics are on the minds of pet food professionals. So we have one here about optimizing the costs related to freeze drying. Could we talk a little bit about the economics of freeze drying?
Optimizing the costs. I guess I'm not certain what the question is as far as that goes.
I guess maybe it's relating to have prices come down for freeze drying over the years? Do you think it might be something that is reaching an economy of scale to where it might become a less expensive option, perhaps? Might be what
Yeah.
they're getting at.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the technology is constantly improving on it. We're able to do more and get it done more efficiently. So I believe that there is some economies of scale there. The biggest challenge with getting into freeze drying is the scaling opportunity. The barrier to entry is that first piece of equipment. Once you've got that first piece of equipment and you keep it running and you keep it full, the machine tends to pay for itself after that. As long as you've got your supply chain in order where you've got a margin available to work with.
Gotcha. I think that leads basically right into our next question here about so what is the smallest size machine possible? How small can a person start with freeze drying?
Well, we see frequently out there in the spaces is there's a lot of people that run the countertop systems, the residential style systems, to kind of prove out their concept, and they kind of come up with their product line, and that's how they start. The biggest challenge is, what do you do after that? And what we see is some will continue to buy just a whole bunch of those, and try to operate a business on a unit that was designed for hobby use, and that provides its own challenges. Going up from there, then to get into the industrial scale, for instance, like our smallest unit, 15 tray system, comes in at just under 100 pounds of product per batch. Once you've gotten to that scale, you just kind of bop up from there, depending on what your specific market needs are. You can go from there all the way up into our large units that are 500 pounds up to 4,000 pounds per batch, depending on what size system you go. There's groups that we're aware of that have worked with us that have started with the small unit, and then just their specific market is keeping them in multiple of our summit model, which is that small industrial model. Other groups started with a summit, turned that into their R&D unit, and now they're processing 2,500 pounds of food per batch in one of our Parker 10 systems. So there's no magic bullet and there's no linear timeline for anybody's process. It's going to be a little bit different for everybody. Ultimately, you just got to do what makes the most sense for your business.
Gotcha. And so it looks like there was a follow-up to that question, asking about where are your machines made?
Yeah, fantastic. So our machines, we fabricate everything. We source from our trusted vendors that we've been working with a long time, but our facility itself is located in Beersford, South Dakota, just south of Sioux Falls.
Gotcha. And so it looks like moving on to a little bit different topic from the machines themselves and to the area around them, the environment. Is there a need or benefit for a modified atmosphere, like a low residual oxygen level when packaging with freeze dried?
That's an interesting question. From everything I'm seeing in the market, from the facilities that I've toured, nobody is doing anything other than standard climate control of their facilities. Nothing out of the ordinary as far as reduced oxygen or anything along those lines.
Gotcha. And looks like we have a very specific question about do you have any comments or insights on why riboflavin appears to be depleted during freeze drying?
Personally, no, I have no comment on that. That sounds like a much better question for somebody else on my team.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and if somebody wants to reach out with specifically about that stuff, I'm happy to dig into it, and we can go from there.
Gotcha.
I believe my contact info is in there.
Yes, I believe that all should be available with the materials that go out after the presentation, and imagine you're pretty easy to track down on LinkedIn or just Googling your name and things like that. I know I was able to find you that way. So, okay, so let's see. How does freeze drying compare in terms of energy consumption versus traditional air drying in terms of like the carbon footprint of the machine operation?
I'm not aware of specifics as far as that goes to show any kind of document or any kind of graph that shows how much energy it uses. When freeze drying, it's another one of those areas that it's not linear. The amount of energy you use to um, process a batch of an animal protein is going to be different than the amount of energy you're going to use for something with a lower moisture content than that, or something with a higher moisture content than that. So it's not really a linear system where you can really just draw definitive lines and say this is the answer to that.
Gotcha. So it looks like we have a question about a hypothetical, perhaps a real world situation here. Like if currently a producer is making 7 batches per week, what is the capacity of the tunnel and how much fresh product goes into that tunnel?
It's going to vary on the size of the equipment. So, this is a batch style system, so you do have to close the door to get that vacuum done. But, our lineup for our systems, you're going to be ranging anywhere from 15 trays at, just under 100 pounds of wet product, all the way up to, well, our most popular one is probably our 420 tray, our Parker 10 systems, and that's approximately 2,500 pounds of wet product. But the thing to remember is that your yield is going to vary from product to product to product. There's a lot of different variables in play here. So, if you're running something that has 40% moisture content versus something that's 80% moisture content, you're going to have different variables there. What you can do on your own is to kind of work it backwards to kind of get an idea of what kind of volume you can put through the different size machines, as long as you understand what your starting moisture content is, and then work it backwards from there.
Gotcha. So here's one about the big, I guess, inflection point that we all had in our lives a couple of years ago about COVID-19 and how has the pandemic or the repercussions of the pandemic influenced consumer demand for freeze-dried pet foods?
Yeah, that's kind of referenced that a little bit earlier. About 4 or 5 years ago, everybody was at home and there was a massive amount of interest in having family pets again. So the industry itself did see a bit of a spike, which led to investment in a lot of the industry, which led to increased capital equipment, increased production, all of that sort of thing. And it seems to still continue to be trending upward, but it certainly had an impact.
Gotcha. So it looks like we've had a request for a flow chart of the freeze drying process. I know we don't really have one of those like immediately available right now, but perhaps there's maybe some resources that you could point guests to of like what you might recommend if people wanted to learn more about just the basics of freeze drying. Is there a website that you might recommend or another source of information? A good
Yeah,
book?
absolutely. That's so we can just kind of talk about it. We'll talk through it first and then I can kind of reference where to kind of follow up on that. Um, Typically you've got a couple different steps in the process. Mainly it's the pre-freeze step. Get that done so that you want all the moisture in the product to be solid. The goal is to take that solid and take it from a solid to a vapor via sublimation, skipping the liquid phase. So once you've got everything frozen in a system like ours, what we would recommend is you've got your product pre-froze. It goes into the carts, goes into the chamber, and then lock it all down, start the process. You're going to have a series of steps that you program into the system of varying heat levels to achieve the sublimation. When the process is complete, you're taking over the system, shutting it down, opening the door, taking your product out, beginning to defrost, because all of that moisture has to go somewhere. It turns into ice within the chamber. You get rid of the ice, take your product to the next step. And if you've done your planning properly, you've already pre-prepped the next run the day before. So then you just reload it and start the cycle over again. If you're in the position of an operation that is running a single shift, you're very typically just limited to one batch per day as your guideline. If you're in a position where you're running 2 or 3 shifts, then you can really capitalize on the actual batch time and your turning over of the machines. If you've got a machine that finishes at 3 in the morning, you don't have to wait until the next business day to turn it over. So there's a lot of different things in play there, as far as that. But that's probably the best high level view of what's going on with the process. We have a resource on our website called Freeze Drying 101, which kind of goes into the details on what's happening and things to consider as you're going through, setting up this process, getting ready to scale, or being able to understand it just as you're starting to research it. If you head to our website at parkerfreezedry.com, you can find the link to Freeze Drying 101 on there.
Perfect. Sounds like exactly what people were looking for. And it looks like we also just got a message from probably one of your teammates, Amber, who also says that at info@parkerfreezedry.com, if anybody wants to reach out directly.
Yeah, yep, for sure. That's a good way. You'll probably hear from myself or somebody else on the team shortly after reaching out to us. And she told me to mention that, and I forgot. So
Oh, she picked it up for you. So it looks like switching gears a little bit here and going back to the consumer's point of view on things. Would you say that freeze-dried products have a competitive advantage or an appeal to consumers, to customers when compared to other methods?
yeah, I think so. As long as it depends on what their goal is with what they're trying to purchase. I mean, if they're looking for the most, healthiest option with the least amount of processing taking place, the least reduction in nutrients, the least reduction in flavors, this freeze drying is the way to go. It really just kind of depends on what they're looking for as an end user. We don't deal a ton with the end users in the position we're in as an OEM, but that's who our customers deal with. So it's something that we pay attention to, but we don't have a lot of influence on.
Gotcha. And switching gears yet again to back to the procedure and all that. Sometimes pet food producers have a problem with neighbors complaining about the odors. Is there an odor component to the effluent from a freeze drying process?
Yeah, I would say that there's some aromatics involved, and it really changes from product to product. We've had some things that that have not smelled the best in some facilities, and we've had some things that smell just like what they do going in. At the end of the day, in the business, the best comment I heard about that was, this, it may not smell very good, but this is the smell of money. So it there is aromatics in play. As you're defrosting the unit, you could, I should say, it isn't you could smell remnants of whatever you processed. If you're changing from one SKU to another, it may be necessary for a little bit of a wipe down, a little bit of a cleaning before you run the next process.
Gotcha. So we're talking about that after it's been finished and you have the final product. One of our guests mentioned that freeze-dried products can be very fragile to handle or seem fragile to handle. Is there a way to improve their durability when they're mixed in with other products?
That sounds like a little bit better on the formulation side of things than on the equipment side of things. I would assume that investigating that and looking to make changes like that, you may want to enlist the help of some formulation experts for something along those lines, because you want to be careful that whatever you're putting in there to increase that durability of the product doesn't have an effect on the process. Are you making a change to increase durability that's going to have a negative effect on everything else? Or is it best to, there's a lot of different things in play there. And that's probably a conversation better had with somebody along those lines that it specializes in the formulation side of things.
Gotcha. When they're making, I know I've seen a lot of products where they're like kibble plus, where it'll be a kibble with some freeze-dried components. So I think that's kind of where they're getting at with that. So pass
Yeah,
that.
we've been seeing that more and more. There's been a certain marketability that they can use that freeze-dried component because people are beginning to be aware of the value that brings and the increased nutrition. So some companies are taking advantage of that and doing a blend instead of a complete freeze-dried process or a complete freeze-dried ingredient list.
It's kind of adding it in as a little bonus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So back again to the machines themselves. If a company was wanting to get started with this and they were to order a machine, how long would it take to get that, I guess, sent to them, set up, like, get the process going?
Yeah, so lead times are going to kind of vary, but typically what you're seeing is going to be, 6 to 8 months is about how long it takes. For us, we don't build for inventory. We every unit is custom made for the person that's ordering it, and we'll set up the design. We'll confirm some layout things with the customer, make sure that everything is set up to their specifications. We'll change a few components out for their specific needs for their specific products. Get everything on order. The fabrication, like I said, takes place down here at our facility down in Beersford. All the components arrive along the process that we'll be basically getting everything assembled, getting everything tested at our facility, leading into a factory acceptance test, which basically at that point is when we prove that everything is working as designed. It's ready for shipment at that point. From that point, then the unit will get shipped to your facility where you're going to have some install take place that involves HVAC and then commercial electric. Once that's all completed, usually maybe a week or 2 weeks of work there, depending on the size or the scale of the project. At that point, that's when your commissioning takes place. And for commissioning, you're probably looking at a Monday to Thursday, Monday to Friday type of an event where the team will be at your facility commissioning the system, and that's beginning the training and operations on that. Beyond that, everything starts to fall into place via our Parker University platform that we put together of a knowledge base, and operators have access to that. It's full of information on maintenance, best practices, troubleshooting, all kinds of different points that just help keep the machine going and your experience being good with the operation of the machine. If there's any questions or anything, there's opportunities for them to connect with our team at that point. We actually will use that feedback from the users to create new content for that Parker University knowledge base.
Gotcha. So for people who maybe are not even ready to take that step, you had mentioned like some of the countertop machines and some of the kind of over-the-counter hobby models. Are there any suggestions or is there an ideal machine that people could start with on that?
There's a handful of brands out there that are making those type of units. You can get them. They're made in the U.S. There's a group out of Canada that's making them. There are plenty of options buying from overseas. Um, so I can't really comment on what's the best one. You just kind of got to figure out what works best for your product, for how much you want to produce, and what kind of research you want to do. The key thing is just take the time to understand it. Understand what's going on with the machine. Understand what's going on with the process, and how does that process affect your product. When you're scaling, one of the biggest challenges is processes, GMPs, your guidelines, your your list of how things are supposed to be done, because consistency is the key. So when you're starting small, it's a lot easier to set up how that is supposed to work at a small scale, and then increase that at a much larger scale when you're ready to grow, as opposed to just winging it the whole time, getting a big machine and then trying to figure it out at that point.
Gotcha, gotcha. Get it a stitch in time, or what is it? Measure twice, cut once, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So going back to the like what actually might be getting freeze dried, what are some of the common products that are used in the pet food industry for being freeze dried? What are some common ingredients to get freeze dried?
Animal proteins is probably the biggest one. We do see a little bit of vegetables in there as well, but primarily it seems like animal proteins is the top by a long shot.
Gotcha. Um, so when we're talking, if somebody was to take that freeze dried pet food and then rehydrate it, what would be the effects on the freeze drying process on the quality attributes of that? Would there be anything that might need to change if somebody was intending it to then be rehydrated?
You know, I I would probably say that you want to make sure you're using small enough pieces so that it rehydrates quickly. If they're going to reconstitute it, they want to be able to have it happen and absorb the water quickly. So much like the process itself, um, you want to make sure that it's not too big so that it doesn't take too long. So make sure you're dealing with small cubes, lots of surface area to reabsorb that moisture.
Gotcha. And we have a question here asking about if you could tell us a little bit about some of the CCPs used or referenced in the HACCP when HACCP plan when freeze drying.
I'm not clear on the acronyms. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. Let's see. Can you speak to the CCPs used or referenced in a HACCP plan when freeze drying? Maybe we'll get another question telling us what those
Yeah, let's
acronyms.
come back to that if somebody can
Okay.
clarify.
So let's see. It's about training. Oh, and here's just I guess, a technical question about the freeze drying process. At what temperature is the moisture removed during freeze drying?
It changes from product to product to product. So the chamber itself is very, very cold. The cold plates are providing extremely cold temperatures, but we're applying heat to the product to get it to that triple point to get that sublimation to take place. And unfortunately, that's another one that's going to be like nonlinear. It's different for animal protein of a red meat versus a white meat, versus a dark meat. There's a lot of variables in play there. The challenge is just, figuring out where that is. You've got some basic guidelines that you can use to kind of give you a starting point as you begin to dial it in. But yeah, unfortunately, there's not a real simple answer for that question. It just really depends on what it is you're processing and how you're going to tackle it.
Gotcha. Depends on the ingredient. So, going back to the market for freeze-dried pet food ingredients, could you give us any more information of your experience of how the market has grown over the past 5 to 10 years? If there's any data you might have on a compound annual growth rate, and then within that, has the market for pet foods or freeze-dried ingredients in pet foods and pet treats been equal, or has one or the other been seeing a greater growth in freeze-dried demand?
Those are pretty specific, and I know the data's out there, and I've seen it and I've read it, but I didn't bring any of that with me today as far as cagers go and actual growth rates and anticipated growth rates. So that's going to be one of the things that we'll definitely follow up with after. If whoever's asking that question, reach out to me, and I'll share the information that I've received over the years talking about the trends in the industry.
Gotcha. Okay, so back to the process itself. What kind of cleaning is involved after a freeze drying run?
Well, hopefully not much if you did it right. The messiest ones is usually when something has gone wrong with the process. But what your product is going into the pans, which are going into the carts, which is then going into the chamber. So in theory, in most scenarios, you're not having to deal with a lot of deep cleaning or anything in the chamber itself. It's going to be typically just a wipe down, sanitize it, in between runs, whatever your GMPs require. The pans, obviously, they need to be cleaned in between runs. You're going to want to make sure you take care of that so that, pre-product and post-product, there's no cross-contamination there. The carts themselves, it's typically you want to wipe them down and definitely look for any debris that may have spilled out during the process or during the transport of moving it in and out of the chamber. Keep an eye on making sure that you're not getting any cross-contamination that way either.
Gotcha. And so it looks like we got a little bit more of the acronyms are hazard analysis critical control point and critical control point. So let's go back here and see what the question. So the critical control points used or referenced in a hazard analysis critical control point when freeze drying. Do you have any information on what those might be?
That sounds a lot to me like more like a facility specific topic as opposed to an OEM equipment manufacturer topic. So I'm going to defer to on that. If that's something, whoever's asking that can reach out. I can ask around and see if there's some way that connects with our equipment specifically. But that sounds more like a facility concern than an equipment concern.
Gotcha. And let's see, what products can be freeze dried? How could a manufacturer know if their product could be freeze dried or not, or if the potential ingredient could be freeze dried?
That's a good question. So you've got a couple different options. You can go out and buy one of them small little countertop ones and try it. Or we do offer a testing opportunity with our company through our website, through our consultation form. You can request a test run. And we will load a full batch in one of our smaller units, and we'll ask a bunch of questions, try and find out what the goal is, learn as much as we can about your product, have any discussions about the experience you've had with it thus far, and if it makes sense, we'll certainly take a look at giving it a try and seeing what happens, for lack of a better term.
Gotcha. So we've got another acronym question here. Does your system have a CIP system?
Clean in place? Is that correct?
I would guess, yeah.
Yeah. As far as my understanding of a CIP system goes, what our system is, it is not set up for that. Our carts are mobile, so they would go to another station for cleaning in between runs. Typically part of the process, you've got a little bit of a checklist that you're going to want to do on your carts anyway in between runs. So this becomes just part of your SOGs, running it, making sure that they're cleaned up, they're clear free of debris before you start the next run.
Gotcha. And I have a question asking if you could kind of elaborate a little bit more on determining the shelf life of freeze-dried pet food products.
Well, ultimately, you're removing the moisture. You're typically taking it down to like below 2%. The packaging side of things is going to be a crucial part of this discussion. There's a lot of different places out there that offer packaging. Some packaging is good for freeze dried, some is not. Typically, what we're seeing is a Mylar type of a construction, something without a window on it, so that they're not getting any sunlight in there. And like I mentioned before, what you'll want to make sure you're taking into consideration is it going to be on the shelf long enough that you need to have any kind of oxygen absorber or anything else in there as well. So there's a lot of different scenarios in play as far as the shelf life goes, but typically it has a lot to do with the packaging itself. And I'd probably lean a little bit more on a packaging expert to do a deep dive into that
Gotcha.
as you're researching your specific SKU.
And so it looks like there might have been a question at the earlier point about let's see here. Oh, there it goes. There was a question back at the beginning about does freeze drying lower the water activity of a food post processing?
Well, water activity is going to be one of the tests that you want to do as you're going through your quality side of things, and what you're looking for is going to vary from product to product to product. One of the resources that I use a lot for when people are asking about water activity is I refer them to Zachary Cartwright. I've seen him speak numerous times. I'll be speaking with him again in the spring at a seminar at UNL regarding freeze drying, dehydration, HPP, water activity, and things like that. If that person would like an introduction, I can certainly line that up.
Gotcha. Help them get connected. So on the process or on the process side, is there an energy recovery process for recovering the ice after freeze drying and the heat generated from compressing?
There can be. The system itself is just set up to defrost, and the ice is going to melt eventually. I know some customers are recovering that ice that's coming out of there. Depending on the industry, some are finding value in it elsewhere, whether that's something that's generating steam for another piece of equipment or another process, or if they're able to capture aromatics and finding value in that, in that post phase there. It really just kind of varies on whether or not it makes sense for you to capture it or not, and if you can utilize it after the fact. Also, local regulations, depending on what you're processing. Some municipalities may have a problem with what you're doing with that ice after the fact.
Gotcha. And another question about your units specifically, are they integrated with computers that can provide a report so that auditors can see what the temperatures have been for food safety?
Certainly, yeah, absolutely. So our system provides a trend data, whether it's a PDF form graph that you're looking at that has showed you the entire timeline of the run, or if you want it in a CSV form and you want to really dive in, you can go that way as well. But either way, the systems are set up to provide an exceptional amount of KPIs. And those KPIs is learning how to read them is going to give you a really good picture of what's happening inside the chamber during the process. In addition to that, we're working on some cloud-based applications as well to provide additional information at different levels so that operators are looking what's important to them, management is looking at what's important to them, maintenance is looking at what's important to them, and it's all available in real time.
Gotcha. So I guess kind of circling back to the idea of palatability, are you aware of any flavor reactions being developed during the freeze drying process from a food science perspective?
I'm going to make a little bit of an assumption, but what I'm assuming is, does the taste change because of freeze drying?
That's what I would think, like a Maillard-Browning reaction when you grill
If
something.
Yeah, and I will say this, if the process is done properly, there should be no change in the palatability and the taste of whatever it is you're processing. It's part of the gentleness of the process. What typically happens is if there is a change, it's usually related to the amount of heat that was being applied and how fast that heat was being applied. From a production level, the number one thing everybody wants is make it go faster so we can do more. And usually what ends up happening is, okay, let's just increase the heat. Well, eventually you're no longer freeze drying. You start getting into vacuum drying instead, or just cooking it under vacuum. And that can have an effect on the taste, on the color, on the shape. That can have an effect on everything. The main thing about freeze drying is understanding the timeline of it so that you can remain patient to let it work the way it's supposed to. Because if you start changing those variables, you're no longer doing it the right way. So, in a perfect scenario, there should be no change in palatability or any kind of flavors or anything. That's part of what makes it so attractive for other industries as well.
And I know you had mentioned earlier that one of the most popular ingredients is our protein ingredients, meats and things like that. I know with the popularity of raw pet foods, freeze drying has kind of risen as a way to basically provide raw meat or raw protein products with some of that shelf stability. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that of how freeze drying can allow basically shelf stable raw?
Yeah, so in that discussion, you certainly need to take into consideration, what secondary process you're going to be involving to provide that kill step that everybody asks about. If you use the freeze dryer to provide that, you're increasing the temperature, so you're losing that raw designation. You still have a freeze dried product, but it's no longer considered raw. So once you've determined what your specific route is going to be to do that, yeah, then a freeze dry process allows you to continue to have a raw, shelf stable product line.
Gotcha. And with your systems, are there probes that allow for moisture evaluation before the cycle is complete for optimization of the cycle?
Not yet. Right now, our probes that are in our system will provide data on the inside of the chamber of the temperatures that's being applied and the temperature of the product itself. Depending on how your system is equipped and ordered, that'll determine how many probes we're dealing with and how much control you have. A standard design, the entire chamber is running the same process. In a upgraded design, you're going to have the opportunity to program each cart individually of each other. So you could run different SKUs in a similar batch, as long as you don't have any concerns with cross contamination or anything like that. But at this time, the technology that we've seen on the market, there's no way to really determine specific water activity or specific moisture levels while under vacuum yet.
Gotcha. Um, and then what type of post-chamber environment must the facility have for the defrost stage in regards to airflow and things like that?
Well, our system is designed with a defrost that uses a hot gas defrost that basically cycles through the system. So it's going to use energy generated by itself to push that hot gas through the different cold plates to get the ice to melt. It's set up as a cycle. On our large systems, that refrigeration unit is outdoors in most cases. So you're basically dealing with the standard atmosphere there. All of our customers is pretty typical that they'll have the door open while this is taking place, and some will add a fan to the equation just to get more airflow going through there of just room temperature air going through the system. But keep in mind, this is a lot of ice, so it's not an instant process. If you're running well, for example, our 500-pound system, our Parker 2 system, and you're running a product that is 75% moisture, at the end of that run, you've got 375 pounds of ice that you've got to get rid of. So that system needs to run through its cycles, and it's not all going to melt. It's going to fall off in chunks.
Gotcha. So getting back to the idea of consumer demands and where this is in the market, freeze-dried pet foods do tend to have a higher retail price. Do you foresee this part of the industry scaling up enough at some point to where those prices would come down? And do you have any time frame projection for when that might happen?
That sounds a lot more on the economist side of things than me as an equipment provider. What I anticipate is this industry will continue to grow and continue to be normalized. What that effect that has on the retail market itself, I can't comment on how long that's going to take. What I can tell you, judging by the interest that we receive on a daily, weekly basis, there's no signs of it slowing down anytime soon.
Gotcha. I know I've certainly seen a lot of new products with it as well. And back onto the processing side, is there an ideal moisture and water activity level to ensure product quality and shelf life?
On the moisture side of things, the system is designed to get it as dry as it possibly can. And the longer you leave it in there, that's how you get it there. Watching those KPIs. It's not uncommon to have less than 2% moisture content by the end of it if you've got it programmed right and you've got everything dialed in and set up. It can take anywhere from 3 to 5 runs to really dial things into your most efficient lineup. So that's kind of the goal with most products. There's a couple industries that we serve when they don't want to get that dry, and that provides additional challenges where they're learning how to read the KPIs and working it backwards so they know when to stop the process because their target is 12% instead of 2. And like we mentioned previously, there's no real way to monitor that in real time with the technology that's available currently. So there's a little bit of a figure it out involved, but once you've got it figured out and then you can replicate it, as long as you don't change anything on the input. Because if you change one thing on the size of the product or the amount of product going into that batch, that can, alter those results. So like it all comes back to consistency. As far as water activity is concerned and what your target is there, I'm going to defer that to discussions with Zachary. So once again, if you'd like to speak with him about ideal water activity for your specific product, please reach out and I'll try to make that connection for you to get you in touch.
And just as we're getting towards the very end here, I was wondering about one thing myself. I remember when I was a kid, for my first experience with freeze-dried products was freeze-dried ice cream, the ice cream that the astronauts took into outer space.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like, wow, it's amazing that, they could dry ice cream. But I was wondering, is there anything that absolutely can't be freeze-dried? Are there ingredients that somebody should just give up hope? You'll never be able to freeze-dry that?
Well, high fat stuff is tough. High sugars, alcohols, that doesn't work. Those are kind of the three main things you kind of want to watch out for. Um, Make sure that you don't have high amounts of that in your formulation.
Gotcha. So looks like we've run through all our questions from the audience, and those are some great questions. And it looks like we are running out of time, getting pretty close to the end here. So I'd like to give a great big thank you to you, Matt, Mark Gronke, sales and marketing manager at Parker Freeze Dry, and to Parker Freeze Dry for sponsoring this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro. Did you have any final thoughts or anything that you wanted to add, Matt, before we ended?
First off, thank you for the time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm looking forward to hearing from those of you that want to discuss it further. As far as the industry is concerned, I can honestly say this is a very exciting time to be involved. There is a lot going on in the pet space and in other industries as well. So I look forward to connecting with those of you that want to continue the discussions.
Great. And hopefully you should be seeing a slide that shows the QR for giving us a little feedback. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you will be getting access to all this pretty soon. And so I'd like to say thank you again, Matt, and thank you to all of you out there in our audience. We would greatly appreciate any of your feedback on our chat today. So please scan that QR code that you should now be able to see to access the survey. And we will email a survey link soon as well. Watch for more Ask the Pet Food Pro chats brought to you by Pet Food Forum and Pet Food Industry. I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry, and I'd like to say thanks again to Matt for his expertise, the Watt Global Media staff that made this possible, and to our audience for joining us. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on which hemisphere you call home. So until next time on Ask the Pet Food Pro, bye-bye.